The Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs will come to order. Thank you all for joining us. This hearing will consider President Biden's nominations for two key Treasury roles charged with combating domestic and international terrorism and financial crimes. Brian Nelson to be Treasury's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes, welcome. And Elizabeth Rosenberg to be Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing, welcome. Welcome to your family and friends who are here or watching remotely. Mr. Nelson will introduce his parents coming from California in a moment. Thank you for all your work serving the public, for your willingness to serve in these critical roles. I welcome Senator Leahy, who has arrived, and Senator Padilla, who will arrive shortly, and thank them for taking time to introduce our nominees. Both of the nominees have substantial experience relevant to their critical national security positions to which they have been nominated. If confirmed, both would take on these jobs at a critical time for protecting our country's national security as we work to rebuild alliances abroad while threats of domestic terrorism are on the rise at home. The FBI director testified recently that racially motivated anti-government extremists are likely to be the biggest domestic threat this year, and in 2022, Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence is one of the cornerstones of our country's efforts to combat terrorist financing at home and around the world. The offices these two nominees would lead are charged with protecting our financial system from terrorists and other criminals, and with combating rogue nations, WMD proliferators, money launderers, drug kingpins, and others who threaten our national security. Mr. Nelson brings a strong record of public service, and from our discussions, I think will be a tough, assertive enforcer of our nation's sanction laws against rogue states, money launderers, terrorists, and narco-traffickers. Mr. Nelson clerked for two federal judges and served at the National Security Division of the Department of Justice. He worked extensively on countering terrorism, illicit finance, and other crimes. He went to work for the California Department of Justice, where he served as Special Assistant Attorney General, then as General Counsel to then Attorney General Kamala Harris. Mr. Nelson, we look forward to your testimony and to an ongoing collaboration with the committee following what I hope will be a quick confirmation process. Elizabeth Rosenberg is a senior leader familiar to many members of this committee from her testimony in the past. President Biden has nominated her to serve as Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing. Growing up in Middlebury, Vermont, hence Senator Leahy's attendance. She got her education in my home state, Oberlin College, where I was her congressperson for her time at Oberlin. And she served in a number of senior roles in the Treasury Department working on anti-money laundering, sanctions, and counter-terrorist financing policy. She currently serves as senior advisor to the Deputy Secretary in the Treasury and has distinguished herself throughout her career in policy debates on terrorism, illicit finance, proliferation finance, and sanctions. If confirmed, she'll be responsible for formulating and coordinating the counter-terrorist financing and anti-money laundering efforts of the department and overseeing the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. Her substantial experience makes Ms. Rosenberg uniquely qualified to take on this important role. Ms. Rosenberg, we welcome you back to the committee. We hope your nomination will move through the committee quickly as well. We look forward to testimony from both of you this morning. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Nelson, and Ms. Rosenberg. Welcome to both of you. You have been nominated for senior and important national security roles at the Treasury, as you know. If confirmed, you will directly influence the Biden administration's policies towards China, Russia, North Korea, dangerous non-state actors, and certainly, not least, Iran. So I want to stress today that we need strong leadership at Treasury, and sometimes that means being willing to push back, including on the White House or the State Department, if the policies they're pursuing actually undermine America's national security. An example of this that I want to talk about this morning is the administration's Iran policy. It's very, very concerning. And let me be clear. There are Republicans, including myself, that would work with the administration on a nuclear deal with Iran, but not the Jcpoa. Now, we've reached out to the administration on this, and we've been met with silence. But the most enduring U.S. policy toward Iran would be one that's bipartisan. The Jcpoa's history demonstrates that. The Obama administration entered the Jcpoa with no Republican support and bipartisan opposition. Not coincidentally, when President Trump came into office, he left the deal. If the Biden administration re-enters the Jcpoa with unanimous Republican opposition and bipartisan opposition for a second time, How's that likely to end under the next Republican administration? But instead of taking a bipartisan approach, the administration seems to be racing to offer sanctions relief to an Iranian regime that, in the words of its own chief diplomat, is dominated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a terrorist organization that is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. And what is it that the administration hopes to receive in return for the sanctions relief? First, it says returning to the Jcpoa will put Iran's nuclear program back in the box. And second, the administration hopes that the Iranians will agree to negotiate a longer and stronger deal after we've given away all our leverage in the form of sanctions relief. Both of these ideas are unrealistic. It's hard to say that Iran's nuclear program was ever really in the box. The Jcpoa required Iran to disclose the entirety of its past nuclear activities, for instance. Yet when confronted with evidence of undisclosed nuclear activity at several sites, Iran has refused to offer any explanation whatsoever. And the IAEA is now on record that it can't even attest to the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program. And furthermore, within a few years, key parts of the Jcpoa that ostensibly limit certain elements of Iran's nuclear program are going to expire. So this box offered by the Jcpoa is more like a wet paper bag. Then there's the notion that once the administration lifts sanctions on Iran, then Iran will enter into negotiations for a longer and stronger deal. It's completely unreasonable to believe that Iran will grant concessions to the West after the United States gives up its primary form of leverage on Iran, which is sanctions. And that's especially true given that the new Iranian president, a hardliner who ordered the extrajudicial killings of thousands of political prisoners in 1988 and who is currently under U.S. sanctions, has stated clearly he opposes even talking with the U.S. about limiting Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for terrorist groups. Now, I recognize that neither of you are going to be able to dictate the administration's policy with respect to the Jcpoa. But the status of U.S. sanctions against Iran are at the heart of these negotiations, and if confirmed, you both will play critical roles in enforcing U.S. sanctions around the world that are an essential and vital part of our foreign policy. As such, I think you need to defend the process by which and the people through whom we implement these sanctions. Now, unfortunately, last month, an unnamed senior State Department official, but this is on the State Department's website, suggested to reporters that sanctions imposed by the Trump administration against Iranian entities for terrorist activities were done illegally and without any evidentiary basis. This is a reckless and dangerous comment. And I mention this because it opens up our entire sanctions regime to legal challenges when a senior State Department official says they were imposed illegally. This is a clear instance where your leadership can make a big difference. In the absence of compelling evidence to the contrary, you should publicly make clear that no terrorism sanctions imposed under the previous administration were done illegitimately. So, Mr. Chairman, Iran is one of many of our national security challenges facing our nation. It's one in which the witnesses today will have an important role in this hearing. I hope to hear from both of you candid and straightforward views on these and other issues. And if confirmed, it's critical that you swiftly take up Treasury's important work to advance this important national security interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I will welcome Senators Leahy and Padilla to today's hearing, each of whom wanted to be here in person to introduce the nominees from their states with whom they've had a strong relationship, and in Senator Leahy's case, a long-standing relationship. Senator Padilla will introduce Mr. Nelson, then Senator Leahy will introduce Ms. Rosenberg. If the senators need to leave after their introductions, they may, certainly if they need to. They may want to stay for the openings. That's okay as well. Once they are finished with the introductions, the nominees will be sworn in and will deliver their opening statements. Senator Padilla, you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey, for the opportunity to introduce Mr. Brian Nelson from the great state of California as President Biden's nominee for terrorism, to be the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Department of Treasury. The Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence upholds the integrity of our financial system and protects our nation from security threats. President Biden has committed to tackling corruption as an economic and national security priority, and he has set an ambitious agenda to curb illicit finance, improve accountability, and strengthen international partnerships to combat bad actors. Mr. Nelson is the right person to lead the Treasury Department's efforts to carry out these critical objectives. Mr. Nelson is a dedicated public servant. Before joining the organizing committee for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles, he served in a senior role in the California Department of Justice. There, he led efforts to thwart human traffickers, crack down on transnational criminal organizations, and partnered with other states and foreign nations to prevent criminal activity. Mr. Nelson has also served in the United States Department of Justice, where he was the National Security Division's Deputy Chief of Staff. And in that role, he oversaw the division's work to ensure foreign investments do not have adverse law enforcement, national security, or public safety implications. Mr. Nelson will bring his expertise and dedication to the Treasury Department's critical work of protecting our financial system. I strongly support Mr. Nelson's nomination, and I urge you to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Senator Leahy, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad you're having the hearing, but I also appreciate the opportunity to introduce Elizabeth Rosenberg, who's sitting right beside me. Her husband is sitting directly behind me, and she's the President's nominee to be the next Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing, financial crimes. As you can imagine, I'm proud she's from Middlebury, Vermont, and she graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Oberlin College. I think in the Phi Beta Kappa from Oberlin, she was anticipating the fact that she may appear before you 20 or so years later as chair. She obtained her master's degree from New York University. I'm always glad to be with another Vermonter, but this one's extraordinary. She serves as counselor to the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. She guides and oversees development of major policy. Previously served as Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy, Economics, Security Program at the Center for New American Security. You have all this, and I'm going to put my whole statement on the record so you can go on with this, but you know, she speaks multiple languages, widely published. She's testified before this committee before as an expert. What often isn't mentioned, her first position in government was as a Senate page back in 1994. I had nominated for that. She watched the floor debates. She watched how we incorporate constituent feedback. And I like to think, Ms. Rosenberg, that it helped light that fire, not that you really needed to have anything to light it, but she'll be, if confirmed, responsible for guiding anti-money laundering, anti-corruption. I could go on forever. This is one of the most amazing people I've seen over my years representing our state of Vermont, and I strongly support her, and I will certainly be doing everything possible to move her confirmation on the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Would the witnesses please rise and raise their right hands? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Do you agree to appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of the Senate? Thank you. Please be seated. Mr. Nelson, you may begin your testimony.
There we go. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee, it is a privilege to come before you today as President Biden's nominee for Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Crimes. Thank you to Senator Padilla for his generous introduction. I also want to thank President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Secretary Yellen for placing their confidence in me. I am joined today by my parents, Eddie and Carol, and they have been loving role models for me and my brother. I also want to especially thank my wife, Lane, for her support and shared commitment to public service. I am so proud of her service through this pandemic as the chief executive of our home city, which is why she is unable to join me here today. She is also my partner in raising our wonderful son, 7-year-old Drew. Respect for service has guided my family across generations. In 1906, my great-grandfather became the first African-American letter carrier of a small Mississippi town. His life was threatened for integrating the Postal Service, but his courage inspired a commitment to civic pursuits that spread among his 7 children and endures today. My grandfather, Wayman Eddie Nelson, went on to serve in both World War II and the Korean War, and my father also served in the military before becoming an air traffic controller. My mother's father, Thomas George Lyle, also spent much of his professional life as a letter carrier, and he motivated his children to pursue rich, community-oriented lives. His daughters found careers in public education, and his youngest, my mother, was a special education elementary school teacher for her career. My parents' careers were stressful and demanding, but they approached their roles with dedication, proud of the contributions they made to our broader community. If I am confirmed, I will undertake the responsibilities of the Undersecretary with that same dedication. I am keenly aware of the critical responsibilities associated with the role of Undersecretary. I am humbled by this nomination to lead Treasury's efforts to disrupt and sever lines of financial support for threats to our national security domestically and around the globe, and to strengthen the integrity of the U.S. financial system. The work of Treasury's dedicated and skilled intelligence and enforcement personnel is on the front lines of our effort to protect the American homeland and American interests against terrorists, criminals, and other malign actors, including cyber criminals perpetrating ransomware attacks. If confirmed, I look forward to working with these dedicated men and women and in collaboration with others across our government, our private sector, and with our foreign partners in this effort. Over my career, I've had the privilege to support the country's national security mission in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Earlier in my career, I served as a special counsel and then as Deputy Chief of Staff of the National Security Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. One of my core responsibilities was to oversee the economic national security work of the division's Foreign Investment Review staff, which participates in the Treasury-led Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. In that work, I came to understand the critical role of economic and financial tools in supporting our national security. Following my leadership at the Justice Department, I held senior roles in the California Department of Justice, including as policy chief. As policy chief, I led and executed efforts to combat transnational criminal organizations, dismantle human trafficking networks, and build state and international partnerships to stop money laundering and cyber crimes. I worked directly with my Mexican counterparts and other leaders in the Mexican government to coordinate these efforts. Most recently, I have served as a senior executive on the organizing committee for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles. In this role, I currently direct the efforts to make the 2028 Games secure across all levels of government. This has been an extensive planning and coordination effort because we anticipate it will be the largest peacetime event in world history. If confirmed, I look forward to working with members of this committee on a bipartisan basis to advance our shared interest in supporting and empowering the talented group of national security professionals who are safeguarding our financial system against illicit use and combating terrorist facilitators, proliferators, and others who seek to harm the United States. Thank you very much for your time and consideration, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Ms. Rosenberg, you're recognized. Thank you.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee, it's a privilege to appear before you today. I am grateful to the committee for consideration of my nomination, and I'd like to thank President Biden, Vice President Harris, Secretary Yellen, and Deputy Secretary Adeyemo for placing their confidence in me. In addition, I'd like to thank Senator Leahy for his very kind introduction. On a personal note, I'd like to thank my family for their invaluable support, my children Sophie, Annie, and Alex, and my husband Jonathan, who is here with me today, and whose love, help, and encouragement makes it possible for me to be in the position to undertake the responsibilities associated with the role for which I've been nominated. I'd also like to acknowledge my brother Eli, as well as my parents Jean and David Rosenberg, none of whom were able to join me here today, but who were my first teachers of foreign policy, economics, and the necessity of working for democracy, peace, and human rights. Also, my grandmother Eleanor Gibson and my great-aunt Emily Jack, who, as dedicated professionals at a time when it was rare for women to be in their lines of work, were powerful examples of diligence and courage to contribute to scientific advancement and to national security. In coming before the committee today, I am aware of the significant responsibilities of the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing, leading the office that formulates and coordinates counterterrorist financing and anti-money laundering efforts of the Department of the Treasury. This work requires close collaboration with Congress, across the executive branch, and with foreign counterparts, the private sector, and civil society. It directly supports U.S. goals of strengthening the integrity of our financial system and facilitating a robust economic recovery. The work serves to protect financial institutions and systems of monetary exchange from illicit finance and abuse by terrorists, criminals, kleptocrats, and those who threaten our peace and security. It also directly and immediately advances core U.S. foreign policy interests, including as related to Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and other security threats. The intertwined nature of U.S. economic strength and national security requires a creative, rigorous, and targeted approach in the use of economic instruments to advance U.S. interests. Now, in an era when Treasury's financial tools are often looked to as a first resort to combat threats, and when the United States faces significant international competition, a carefully calibrated strategic approach to anti-money laundering and the use of financial measures is more important than ever. And so, too, is a commitment to work with allies and partners in advancing this critical work. Since 2009, when I joined the office I have now been nominated to lead, I dedicated myself to advancing anti-money laundering and counterterrorist financing policy and crafting targeted strategies for the use of sanctions. I am grateful for the opportunities I've had to learn from the policy pioneers of the contemporary U.S. approach to anti-money laundering and counterterrorist financing efforts. They include Democrats and Republicans, former senior officials at the Department of the Treasury, and congressional leaders, many of whom have served and do serve on this committee. They also include the hardworking, expert Treasury career staff. Leading the Economics and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security for 8 years, I benefited from exposure to a wide array of stakeholder perspectives on anti-money laundering, illicit finance, and sanctions policy, including and beyond the U.S. government. I engaged with representatives from civil society, the private sector, and the diplomatic community to learn their views on these policy issues. I have been honored to testify before Congress and brief bipartisan groups of members and congressional staff on anti-money laundering, sanctions, and national security policy on several occasions, and if confirmed, I intend to continue this collaborative engagement with Congress to advance our shared economic and security interests. In closing, I want to once again thank the committee for its consideration of my nomination, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg. Mr. Nelson, no question about your qualifications or your experience or your knowledge on human trafficking, money laundering, terrorism, other issues. Share with us your priorities and your vision for TFI on sanctions, on countering money laundering, on terrorism financing.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the time and the frank conversation this week. You know, my vision for TFI is really informed by a couple of things. One, I think recognizing that there hasn't been a confirmed leader of TFI for almost 2 years now. So really, I think the first piece of action is to get to work advocating for the tools that we have, that TFI has, and to your point, Senator Toomey, making sure that we're advocating for the voices and the work of the dedicated professionals that are doing that work, and that is seen and felt throughout the interagency with our foreign partners and obviously with this committee and Congress. Two, my real introduction into how impactful the tool of countering the financing of terrorism came at the National Security Division. And when I arrived at NSD, it was really at a time when, in 2009, we were seeing terrorist plots that were being directed by foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda here in the United States. And what we saw and what I observed over the 2.5 years that I was there is that that opportunity for these foreign terrorist organizations to direct terrorist plots in the United States, in our homeland, was significantly degraded. And the reason for that was because of the execution of the countering of financing terrorism that TFI led. And I know that work has saved American lives, and I know how important it is to execute against that tool. So one of the very first things I would want to do is participate in the ongoing sanctions review that is being led by the Treasury Secretary and the Deputy Treasury Secretary to make sure that we are making that tool, that incredibly powerful tool of our foreign policy and national security, as effective and targeted as possible while managing and mitigating unintended consequences. The second piece of my experience that I think relates directly to my vision and my priority for TFI comes from the California Department of Justice. And when I was the policy chief in the California Department of Justice, we did a review of the threat posed to us by transnational criminal organizations. And in the context of that review, what we assessed is one of the reasons transnational criminal organizations were so interested in California was for many of the reasons that they're interested in are using our financial systems, which is big and open and global. So really looking at the preventive tools, advancing our preventive tools, anti-money laundering, and other tools, much like TFI, to really harden our systems in California is something I worked on. And that, obviously in the context of the Anti-Money Laundering Act and its implementation, is something that I want to prioritize and work hard with the leaders at FinCEN to land well. So I will stop there. Obviously, there are a lot of subject matter and substantive issues I would want to tackle as the Undersecretary if I am so fortunate to be confirmed. But those are...
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Ms. Rosenberg, near the end of the last Congress, we passed the Bipartisan Anti-Money Laundering Act and Corporate Transparency Act. Strong support from Senator Jcpoa, then the chair of this committee, and the support of this whole committee. Which of the many new requirements of the new law, in addition to establishing, two questions I have for you, which of the new requirements, in addition to establishing the beneficial ownership database, should be our top priority? And second question, what should be the Treasury's priorities to implement the law most efficiently and effectively?
Thank you for that question. There we go. There are a variety of, I'd like to recognize the leadership from this committee and from many others in Congress who brought forward that piece of legislation which meaningfully strengthens the anti-money laundering legal basis for our country and also empowers those individuals who implement and enforce it. There are a variety of very significant provisions, as you all know, within that law that have the effect of the complementary effect of significantly strengthening the overall AML regime. I'd like to point to the fact that Secretary Yellen has given particular focus and attention to the beneficial ownership database and the activities associated with setting that up, including the rulemaking, the technology, the procurement, the staffing. And if I am confirmed, I would look forward to supporting that effort. With regard to your second question and Treasury's the prioritization there, of course, the requirements associated with this piece of legislation are meaningful and require resources and support in order to execute them. That's an area that Secretary Yellen and Deputy Secretary Adeyemo have called out, particularly looking forward to appropriately resourcing those provisions in order to be able to carry them out to the full extent, and that's something I would seek to support if confirmed.
Thank you. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rosenberg, in 2016, you wrote, and I quote, "Using sanctions to address non-nuclear concerns with Iran is distinct from oversight of the nuclear deal," end quote. Now, we had a nice conversation last week, and I recall, I think you confirmed that that is still your view, but I'd like to get it on record and out in the open here. And I think this is a yes or no question. I certainly hope so. And that is, do you still maintain and agree that terrorism sanctions on Iranian entities are not inherently inconsistent with the Jcpoa?
Senator, thank you for the question, and thank you also for taking the time to speak with me prior to this hearing. I support the position that the United States must hold Iran accountable for its support for terrorism and its destabilization in the region. That is something that can occur outside of any nuclear deal should the United States re-enter it.
Okay, so I would take that as a yes. Mr. Nelson, you stressed the importance of fighting terrorism, so really I would ask you to provide hopefully a yes or no answer to the same question. Do you agree that terrorism sanctions on Iranian entities are not inherently inconsistent with the Jcpoa?
I do.
Thank you. Now, earlier when I made my remarks, I highlighted a recent statement from an unnamed, quote, senior State Department official suggesting that terrorism sanctions imposed by the previous administration were done illegally and without any evidentiary basis. So first, for Ms. Rosenberg, I know you're counselor to the Deputy Secretary of Treasury now. I think this is a simple yes or no question. Are you personally aware of any evidence that those sanctions were imposed illegitimately?
No, Senator, I am not.
Okay. That being the case, I would be very grateful if you would commit to, within, say, 7 days of your confirmation, if you could confirm that these sanctions were, in fact, imposed legitimately. And Mr. Nelson, I would ask you to join in that effort. I just think it's extremely important when somebody maligns the character of the expert Treasury staff that went through the proper procedure, went through the process, and came to this conclusion. Their work should not be maligned this way, and I think your voices are important to affirm that. Next point, Nordstrom 2 AG is a company owned and operated by Russia's largest state-owned oil and gas company, Gazprom. Now, according to its own website, Nordstrom 2 AG is responsible, and I quote, for planning, construction, and subsequent operation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, end quote. Now, the State Department has reported that Nord Stream 2 AG is using a Russian pipeline contractor, and I'll mispronounce the name, but I'll call it Koksohimtrans, and they're using this contract, essentially a subcontractor on this project. Now, it's notable because Koksohimtrans was sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury in 2016 for its involvement in Russia's invasion of Crimea. Now, all of this is important because under Section 228 of Katsa, Nord Stream 2 AG has to be sanctioned if it's facilitating a significant transaction with a sanctioned entity. And it clearly appears to be doing exactly that with Koksohimtrans. So, Ms. Rosenberg, my question for you, I know you're leading a systemic review of the Treasury sanction. Can you explain to us why Nord Stream 2 AG has not been sanctioned under Katsa, despite the clear language of that legislation requiring it?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this issue, and I'd like to recognize the leadership from this committee that brought forward legislation, including authorities that you're referencing here, and Katsa, as well as other ones related to Nord Stream 2. I share a deep concern about Russia's potential to destabilize energy security in Europe, and particularly to target Ukraine if there is a cessation of natural gas there, facilitated by additional flow of gas through the Nord Stream pipeline. I am not in the position to have examined the facts and circumstances about whether there's the entity that you've named would meet criteria or threshold for designation. But if I'm confirmed, I can commit to you that I would look into that and would gladly come and follow up with you about that question.
So I guess it's my same point as last time. I would appreciate if you would reply in writing, if both of you would reply to this question, because my reading of the statute is very straightforward. it requires the sanctioning. The sanction can then subsequently be waived, but there's a process that we need to go through, and it involves Congress, and it's important. I do have one other quick question, Mr. Chairman, if I could, and that is, in recent months, Iranian oil shipments to China has, by all accounts, gone through the roof. It could be approximately 600,000 barrels per day at this point. By all accounts, China's been openly violating U.S. law with impunity because they're importing illicit Iranian oil. So my question to both of you, first, do you acknowledge that it is a problem to have China flagrantly violating our sanctions law? And isn't it the case that if adversaries perceive that the U.S. is unwilling to enforce our own sanctions, then they're going to violate the sanctions?
Senator, obviously I'm not in the government. I would welcome the opportunity, if I'm confirmed, to be briefed on this incredibly important issue. But predicate, assuming there are violations, then I would agree. We need to act appropriately.
Senator, I would certainly agree that violating U.S. sanctions law is a problem and something that, if I were to be confirmed, would be something I would look into and seek to address. Furthermore, that the credibility and strength of U.S. sanctions depends on their effective implementation and enforcement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your indulgence. And I'm going to send both of you a QFR in writing about a recent Financial Action Task Force guidance involving cryptocurrencies and personal digital assets. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Menendez from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations to both of your nominations. In my other role as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the question of sanctions is one of the critical tools that we use in our foreign policy in order to get countries who are violating the international order to observe it or to get in line with it, or to create consequences for those who are unwilling to get in line with it. And it is one of the few peaceful diplomacy tools that we have. Other countries like Russia use their military to engage in their foreign policy advocacy. We do not do that as a democracy. So your two positions are incredibly important, and I have to be honest with you, with me personally, how you respond is going to be critical to my support for your nominations, because this is one of the critical areas that I think is important and I think is lacking. So I give you that as a framework warning, and I will have more questions than this 5 minutes allows me to, so I'll submit some of them for the record. I'd ask you to be significant in your answers. If I get the typical answer I get in a QFR, it will not garner my support. So I'd like to see substantive answers. With that as a framework, Katsa, which I helped write, remains the law of the land and provides a congressionally mandated sanctions framework on Russia. The Trump administration ignored many of its mandatory, I'll underline, mandatory provisions, much to the consternation of many of us in the Senate, and I would just remind you that this legislation passed 98-2. So if a simple yes or no would do this, do I have each of your commitment that you will fully implement all mandatory provisions of the law?
Yes.
Yes, Senator.
Now, I believe that pressure on Russia's oligarchs could have an impact on the Kremlin's decision-making calculus and have supported blocking sanctions on them in close coordination with our European allies. Do I have your commitment to fully review the list of sanctions targets proposed by Alexei Navalny's organization earlier this year?
Yes, and thank you for your long leadership in that area.
Yes, Senator, and I would welcome the opportunity, if confirmed, to look broadly at potential sanctions targets, individuals, entities that may be eligible for such designation.
Now, the Trump administration negotiated a memorandum of understanding that eased sanctions on Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. I was opposed to the easing of those sanctions, but it's critically important that all terms of this agreement be fully met by Deripaska. So, again, yes or no, if he does not abide by its terms, would you support the reimposition of sanctions on him?
If confirmed, yes, I'll look at that, and to your point, yes, if he's not abiding by the terms.
Yes, Senator, I will certainly look into this and consider any available and appropriate measures to address the threats that he has.
Okay, I appreciate you both looking into it. My specific question is the reimposition of sanctions if he does not meet the terms. Here's our problem, and I want to echo what the ranking member said. China is, I can tell you, you may not know, or you may know, but figured you can not have to deal with it until you get confirmed. China is fully violating our sanctions, over $1 billion. So when we send a global message that it's okay to go ahead and violate U.S. sanctions, then every other country will. And so we neuter the one foreign policy tool that we have of peaceful diplomacy. It's not acceptable, not to mention that it violates congressional will specifically. It's not a shall, it's not a may, it's a shall. So there's a reason we put shall. And yes, sometimes there are waivers, and that's up to the administration to do that. But it starts off with a shall. Let me ask you this. How would you approach, there is, my understanding is there are soon-to-be completed negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal. If the United States reaches an agreement with Iran in its nuclear program, how would you approach the sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran that the Trump administration imposed? For example, there are those who would advocate just lifting the sanctions as part of a deal in its totality, but isn't it possible to consider specific licenses in which the central bank doesn't get a total wash, but actually would have specific licenses to do certain things that are otherwise sanctionable?
Senator, thank you for that question. I'm obviously not in the government yet, but again, I'm happy to look at that and would be very happy to continue to talk to you about what good strategies are, both to protect the overall sanctity of our sanctions program and their effectiveness, which again, appreciating your long leadership in this area, and specifically on how to address the Iranian central bank.
Isn't it possible, and I'll close on this, Mr. Chairman, to consider a specific license versus an overall lifting? I mean, as a procedural matter, forgetting about the policy of whether the administration will tell you to do that or not.
Well, as you know, we do have the authority to provide licenses under certain circumstances. So I would need to talk with OFAC leadership about this specific.
Ms. Rosenberg, can you just answer that one question?
Senator, I appreciate the creativity and insight that you open here in thinking about various tools that the U.S. government may have in seeking to hold Iran accountable. I believe that is an option.
Yeah, I'm going to have very specific questions. Again, I want to urge you, I'd like to be supportive, but your views on these are going to really dictate my support. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir. Senator Haggerty of Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Toomey, for holding this hearing, and congratulations to the two of you for your nomination. I'd just like to note at the start that America's financial markets are the envy of the world. We worked very hard to create the most liquid, the most efficient, the greatest provider of low-cost capital in the world, and it's a privilege to access the American capital markets, and those that would act against U.S. interest should clearly be denied that privilege. That's the important role that the two of you are undertaking today, and I want to echo Senator Menendez's comments. This is a critical tool of diplomacy that the two of you are going to be in a position to exercise. I think both Mr. Nelson and Ms. Rosenberg, if you're confirmed, I think we'll have an opportunity to work closely together on matters of national security, on safeguarding our financial system, and constricting our enemies' access to a financial lifeblood that they may use to our detriment. I'd like to come back and follow up on something that Ranking Member Toomey highlighted, and that is some very reckless commentary by a member of the State Department, the Biden administration State Department back in April, that the sanctions that were issued by the Trump administration were illegitimate somehow. Let me tell you, I worked my heart out in the last administration to impose sanctions on Iran, to get Japan to stop buying Iranian oil. Iran is the largest state sponsor of terror in the world. I want to ask both of you, first Mr. Nelson, then Ms. Rosenberg. Do you think that those sanctions were illegitimate?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for the meeting and the time and the frank conversation. I'm not in the government now, but I can speak from my experience when I was at the National Security Division working with the dedicated career staff at Treasury, and I have every reason to believe that they are not only incredible public servants, but incredibly diligent in their work, and that was my experience of them, and I would have no reason to question the evidentiary basis of any of the packages, sanctions packages that they produce. And I would also just want to note that it would be really a wonderful opportunity to continue to think about and work together on how we can combat and address through our sanctions programs and other tools Iran's ongoing facilitation of terrorism, their support for terrorist proxies and other malign acts. And I would welcome the opportunity to work on those issues with you.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Ms. Rosenberg.
Thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to share with you my views that the dedicated, excellent staff at Treasury who work on targeting, investigations, licensing, enforcement have conducted themselves in an excellent fashion and have implemented their sanctions in this portfolio and in others with great integrity.
Well, beyond impinging the character of those who did this hard work, as Senator Toomey underlined, it also runs the risk when we have these sort of reckless comments coming from State Department officials or any other officials in the administration. When they comment that our sanctions are somehow illegitimate or illegal, it exposes our entire sanctions framework to legal challenge, which again would be very much to the detriment of U.S. government activities in our efforts to impose sanctions. Again, a great diplomatic tool is highlighted by Senator Menendez. So I appreciate the fact that you agree with me that that was a reckless statement and that you would act accordingly to uphold that. I'd also like to ask both of you, first Mr. Nelson, then Ms. Rosenberg, if you'll commit to total transparency with this committee about the Biden administration's financial dealings with our adversaries. And here I'm thinking about the pallets of cash that we saw going to Iran. Mr. Nelson.
Thank you for that question, Senator. I think the committee's oversight responsibility is incredibly important, and I would communicate about that and every other issue within its jurisdiction as appropriate to the extent that I can.
Thank you.
Senator, I can commit to transparency and full and frank exchange with this committee if confirmed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations to both nominees. Welcome, congratulations, and welcome to your families as well. Let me start with cryptocurrency fraud. To both of you, as you well know, money laundering, tax evasion, terrorist financing, and fraud follow these privately created and managed currencies. If confirmed, how will you work with federal regulators to limit the damage done by crypto heists? And Mr. Nelson, let me start with you.
Thank you for that question, Senator Masto. Obviously, this is an issue that has been of great concern for some time now, and is reflected in the new Anti-Money Laundering Act that this committee really championed. And if I'm confirmed, I will prioritize implementing the pieces of that piece of legislation, including new regulations around cryptocurrency. I think that legislation provided new authorities or clarified the law that cryptocurrencies or currency in whatever form, be it virtual or fiat, is covered by the Bank Secrecy Act, which is a powerful tool to allow FinCEN to ensure that, again, no matter the form of the currency, that they have the tools to regulate. And I think the other really powerful piece of that legislation is that it reflected a balancing of regulating to prevent virtual currency and other types of new technology from undermining our anti-money laundering system, while also being respectful of the fact that we need to support responsible innovation and preserve that here in the United States and not see that market and opportunity leave the country. So again, I know this is a space that FinCEN and the leadership of FinCEN have been active in for a long time, and additionally, it's will be the work of TFFC and others within TFI to really rally our global partners so that we have one consistent standard across the world.
Thank you. Ms. Rosenberg?
Thank you. You've mentioned these crypto heists, this threat, which hurts people and it hurts institutions. And if confirmed, I would welcome the opportunity to examine our AML-CFT regime, which, as Mr. Nelson points out, applies to currency and to financial institutions, regardless of whether they are brick or mortar or if they are of this new and emerging fashion of technology, such as you've referenced. That is work that must be undertaken in close collaboration with those colleagues of the AML professionals and leaders in our government who work on financial stability and on consumer protection. And I would seek to, if confirmed, ensure that the regulatory regime that applies to cryptocurrency, for example, is appropriate and consistent across these various areas of regulation.
And do either one of you see work with international law enforcement with other nations to address this issue as well? And could you talk about that?
Absolutely, Senator. Something that TFFC, the office that I am nominated to lead, is very important in doing is coordinating with international counterparts and seeking to support, assist, and educate counterpart jurisdictions, financial regulators, and leaders to implement the appropriate laws and controls. And frankly, without that kind of collaboration and without other countries having the appropriate regulatory framework, it's all too easy for criminals to avoid U.S. jurisdiction and conduct their illegitimate and criminal activity from another jurisdiction. So that kind of international coordination is absolutely essential to understanding and getting after the risk that exists with cryptocurrencies.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson, anything further?
No, just one other note is thinking about in the context of the new cybersecurity tools, the president, through his executive order, and there will be opportunities to work with law enforcement and take actions with those tools as well. So,
thank you. And you both touched on this, and we have been talking about this, but I was able to work with my colleagues, Senators Cassidy, Moran, Sinema, Warren, on the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network Improvement Act, and that was included in the Anti-Money Laundering Act. And this bill gives FinCEN the authority to work with tribal governments to monitor digital currency and investigate financial issues related to domestic terrorism. It is new tools for FinCEN, and I am hopeful that recognizing these new tools, that we are also ensuring that FinCEN is carrying out those and implementing that law. So please, and this is a follow-up, and I'm out of time, but I want to make sure that FinCEN is partnering with our tribal governments to address possible criminal or terrorist financing. As you well know, Mr. Nelson, we have seen this type of activity domestically, and this is what's really driving the work around this for me with respect to FinCEN. So my time is up. I will submit additional questions, but thank you again, and congratulations on your nominations.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Cortez. Now, Senator Lemus from Wyoming is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nelson, I want to concentrate on cryptocurrency, too, and draw your attention to the recent Colonial Pipeline ransomware saga. Our law enforcement agencies were able to recover about 85% of the digital assets paid as ransomware within 2 weeks of the initial breach. One of the reasons that we were able to accomplish this was through the use of digital asset analytics providers like Chainalysis, Elliptic, and CipherTrace, which are highly effective at harnessing data available on distributed ledgers. Research from one of those firms highlights that illicit activity in the digital asset space has decreased from 2% in 2019 to 0.34% in 2020, which is much less than the amount of illicit cash activity each year. So my question to you, Mr. Nelson, is, isn't the Colonial Pipeline ransomware saga and other recent prosecutions demonstrative of how far the investigatory tools of law enforcement have come in the digital asset space?
Thank you. Thank you for that very salient question at this moment. I'm not in the government, so I'm not. I don't know exactly what tools FinCEN has at their disposal today. I do know that they are actively engaged on this question through their Bank Secrecy Act advisory group, where they engage with industry about tools to help support their AML CFT mission. And I can commit to you that if confirmed, I will be briefed on understanding what tools FinCEN does have, and we'll be very happy to come back to you and continue to discuss that with you, and ensure that they are aware of all the tools that are available out in the marketplace.
Thanks, Mr. Nelson. It seems to me like we would still be working on recovering this money if it was done by wire transfer or other traditional payment rails. So there are real advancements in this space of which many people, I think, are unaware. Mr. Nelson, I want to urge you and my colleagues to remember that all digital assets are not alike. It's pretty straightforward for investigators in digital assets like Bitcoin to comply with AML-BSA laws, for example. However, it's very difficult for users of Monero, for example, to comply with the law. The Monero white paper even states that other digital assets have, quote, critical flaws, they call them flaws, unquote, in that they leave a highly visible trail of transactions on a blockchain, which Monero doesn't do. So I would draw the committee's attention to an article in the Financial Times today that states that criminals are increasingly moving away from digital assets like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Cardano, and increasingly towards assets that have privacy-enhancing features like Monero. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent that this article from the Financial Times be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Nelson, do you have any thoughts on how we should treat digital assets that comply with our Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering laws and our sanctions laws versus those that cannot comply with the law?
Thank you for that question, and if confirmed, I will commit absolutely to studying the issue and engaging with FinCEN leadership on this question. I think philosophically, the way I would approach it is to be less focused on the technology, but focused on crimes and criminals, and using the tools that we have at TFI to drive out the crimes and the criminals, and creating, obviously, space for appropriate use of our systems.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. And one last quick question. Can you talk a bit about your views on how responsible innovation can maintain U.S. economic leadership in the world? I refer specifically to China being in the final stages of developing its central bank digital currency, and the European Union announcing the European Payments Initiative of 2020. We can be a global financial innovation leader, but it's a privilege, not a right. So thanks for your comments, and congratulations on your nomination.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
If confirmed.
Senator Warren, working on her birthday from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And congratulations to both of you on your nominations. Good to see you here today. Money laundering is a massive problem in our financial system. According to the United Nations, as much as $2 trillion is laundered globally each year. This is dirty money that criminal networks, scammers, corrupt oligarchs move through the banking system to evade the law. Now, last year, Congress took an important step in reforming our anti-money laundering rules and gave the Treasury Department significant new authorities to crack down on illicit finance, including requiring companies to disclose their true owners so that bad actors can't hide behind the anonymity and funnel money through the country. You both are going to be in charge of writing the regulations to implement these changes. So I'd like to start off by asking you, Ms. Rosenberg, what specifically will you do to ensure that Treasury and FinCEN are writing the strongest possible rules to stop illicit finance?
Thank you very much for the question. If confirmed, I would seek to be an active partner for colleagues at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network working on writing the rules. They have several very significant issues to consider and on which they've sought feedback from some of the people who've written this law and other stakeholders concerning the definition, requirements for who files, for who has access, and I would seek to be a strong partner in trying to get to the strongest, best piece of regulation possible.
Good. I like hearing this. You know, I think these steps are critical to making sure that the information that's provided by these companies is clear, comprehensive, and easily accessible. But collecting this information is just part of the puzzle. Last year, documents obtained by BuzzFeed and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, known as the FinCEN files, showed the extent to which giant banks have helped criminals launder money, evade sanctions, and commit other financial crimes. Let's take HSBC, for example. After admitting in 2012 to allowing drug cartels to launder hundreds of millions of dollars through its branches, HSBC then helped another customer involved in a massive Ponzi scheme move the money it scammed from people, even though there was evidence that the customer was engaged in illicit activity. Mr. Nelson, was HSBC or any of its executives ever indicted by the federal government for these misdeeds?
Not that I'm aware of.
Nope, they were not. HSBC paid a fine and was put on probation, which didn't stop it from continuing to help criminals launder money. So, Mr. Nelson, let me ask you, do you support using every tool possible to hold financial institutions accountable, including criminal prosecutions for corporate executives?
I do, Senator, and as you know, thank you for that question, and thank you for your leadership in this area, and I have some experience of it from my work in California on mortgage service fraud. So I'm very familiar with the structure and historically how difficult it has been to prosecute executives of servicing and other financial institutions. I would note, really from a Treasury perspective, the front line are the supervisors and the examiners, and making sure that they're well-resourced. You in this committee have provided a new tool and a much more significant whistleblower provision, and I think that will be really powerful to the extent we are able to make a case for willful violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. Obviously, the criminal prosecutions are possible under current law, but I know you and others are seeking to add new tools to allow that process. So
Good.
I thank you for your leadership.
I really appreciate that. I think it's very important. I like your approach to this. My ending Too Big to Jail Act would go further, and it would require bank executives to certify that no fraud is occurring on their watch, and then be held personally liable if that turns out not to be the case. It would also overhaul the use of deferred prosecution agreements that allow banks to avoid criminal penalties, and it would give FinCEN the ability to investigate criminal activity at banks on their own without having to rely on DOJ. If we want to put an end to money laundering, strong rules aren't good enough. We need strong enforcement, and we need penalties with teeth to ensure that we have real reform and real accountability at the biggest financial institutions. I look forward to supporting both of you and look forward to working with you on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tillis is recognized for 5 minutes from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nelson, Ms. Rosenberg, thank you for being here, and congratulations on your nominations. Ms. Rosenberg, I believe, and I know some other members have asked you this question, but that you support re-entering the Iran nuclear deal. And I think you may have gone so far as to write an article that was titled on the broader issue of dealing with Iran, that the maximum pressure on Iran won't work. But since we implemented the maximum pressure campaign, if my statistics are correct, over 2 million barrels a day of Iranian oil were kept off the market, and over 30 countries who were regular buyers are no longer importing Iranian oil. And the IMF reports this campaign brought Iran's foreign reserves to just about $4 billion. As a state sponsor of terror, as a country that's just had another sham election, do you believe that we should apply pressure to Iran, just not through the Jcpoa? And why?
Senator, thank you for the question. I have long been concerned about the threats that Iran presents to the United States and U.S. interest, and I very much appreciate that that's something that is a concern for many members of this committee and for Congress more generally. If I am lucky enough to be confirmed into this position, the position for which I've been nominated would welcome the opportunity to think critically about the right policies, including sanctions, to hold Iran accountable for its support for terrorism, its regional destabilization, its concerning nuclear activity. The Biden-Harris administration has said that it will re-enter the Iran deal, remove sanctions if Iran makes good on its nuclear concessions, and furthermore, that it will seek to hold Iran accountable for its support for terrorism. That's something I would, if confirmed, welcome the opportunity to work with you on, to fully understand your concerns and create strong policy for our government.
Thank you. I see Mr. Nelson nodding. You generally agree with Ms. Rosenberg's response?
I'm not in the government, but I generally agree.
Good. I can conserve my time. I've got something that I am very interested in talking with you, Ms. Rosenberg, about. You've in the past talked about the export of LNG as a key strategic weapon to counter Russia's revenue making. Now we have Nordstrom 2 back online. I met with several ambassadors from that part of the world for dinner last night, and there was an interesting discussion. And one of their responses led me to believe that you haven't really given us much choice. I mean, we could be an exporter, a major exporter of energy in this country, but with the cancellation of pipelines, the limits on what we're able to extract out of the United States really makes even a policy. I'm curious to see if you still believe that we should have exports, significant exports of LNG to particularly friendly countries, but do you still believe that that should be a priority, one? And how do we balance that against the administration's really attack on domestic energy production since he's been in office for the last 6 months?
Thank you for the question. I have long been interested on a personal level in energy security and responsible stewardship of U.S. natural resources. And if confirmed into the position for which I'm nominated, would be in the position to focus on any money laundering and sanctions policies, and would defer the setting of policy with regard to natural resource stewardship and natural gas to my colleagues in other agencies, Interior, Energy, with responsibility for that. But I can appreciate the concerns that you've raised, particularly with regard to Russia, natural gas, Russia's potential to threaten energy security in Europe, and would, if confirmed, like to work with you and other members of the committee on that set of issues.
Okay, and just back to the Iran deal, when we talk about going back to the Iran deal, are we talking about the deal that the prior administration exited, or something that looks different? And if it's something that looks different, would you think that it would be prudent for us to consider it rising to a level of a treaty so that it has enduring value versus only as good as the next administration?
Thank you for the question. I'm not party to the negotiations that are occurring, so I unfortunately cannot speak to the parameters or the provisions, how it may be similar or dissimilar to the previous Jcpoa if it is agreed. But I know our time is short. I could keep it there.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions for the record, Mr. Nelson. I'm sorry I didn't get to any questions for you, but again, congratulations to you all and your families on this honor, and wish you the very best. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Till. Senator Ossoff from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. Congratulations on your nominations. I'd like to ask you both about the commitment that you can make as prospective leaders of OTFI to comply with requests for information from Congress. In addition to serving on the Banking Committee, I chair the Homeland Security Committee's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And this subcommittee, also known as PSI, has a long and productive history of working closely with the Treasury Department to investigate money laundering, sanctions evasion, and financial crime. And the subcommittee often relies heavily on documents like suspicious activity reports or SARs filed with FinCEN to do that work. Unfortunately, in a recent review of the permanent subcommittee's efforts, I learned that at times in recent years, the production of documents that Treasury typically provides to the subcommittee swiftly and within days instead began to take months for the completion of the production of those materials. And at one point, Treasury officials even questioned the subcommittee's need for and ability to properly handle SARs and intervene with private banks to try to block their compliance with subpoenas issued by the subcommittee. Much of that has been ironed out, and luckily a lot of progress was made in restoring the trusting and prompt and responsive working relationship between the department and particularly OTFI and the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. My question for each of you is, will you commit to working with me and the staff of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations as well as the Banking Committee to ensure that documents requested by PSI are swiftly and appropriately provided by the Treasury Department so that we can do our important oversight work? I'll start with you, please, Ms. Rosenberg.
Yes, Senator, I can commit to doing so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Appreciate that. Ms. Rosenberg, regarding ransomware and the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, curious whether you believe that the new authorities provided to Treasury by that legislation can be used to counter this proliferating ransomware threat. Oftentimes, the threat actor in a ransomware attack is financially motivated. So how could the Anti-Money Laundering Act or perhaps other federal statutes that would authorize your components, should you be confirmed, operations, help shift the risk-reward balance against ransomware attackers?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. And just to take a step back and recognize the danger that and disruption that ransomware attacks present to so many communities, to institutions. Certain recent events have made it central as a news focus, but it also has existed and is a serious problem for smaller organizations and communities. Treasury has a number of authorities and important roles to play when it comes to identifying and going after the attackers who conduct these ransomware attacks. There are provisions of the new Anti-Money Laundering Act that would serve to strengthen some of those Treasury capabilities. But Treasury's opportunities to work in this space are even beyond some of those new provisions. They involve working closely with law enforcement to track the financial footprints of ransomware attackers, working with financial institutions to ensure that they have appropriate information so that they can file appropriate suspicious activity reports when there is a ransomware payment made. And if confirmed, I would welcome the opportunity to work on this terrible and disruptive set of criminal activity.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg. Appreciate it. And indeed, just in the state of Georgia, March 2018, the city of Atlanta suffered a crippling ransomware attack. Just this past Thursday, a large hospital system in Savannah, Georgia, St. Joseph's Candler, was attacked. Of course, the recent high-profile attack on Colonial Pipeline, which is headquartered in Georgia as well. So will you commit, Ms. Rosenberg, to working with my office, with local leaders in Georgia, with the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations as well to help address these cybersecurity threats in Georgia and nationwide?
Certainly, Senator. I would be honored to do so if confirmed.
Thank you. And with my short remaining time, Mr. Nelson, Could you please comment on the authorities that the Anti-Money Laundering Act provides with respect to improving transparency in corporate ownership, determining beneficiary owners of shell companies, and helping to see into some of the complex financial networks that can be used to obscure financial flows, whether within the United States or internationally?
Yes, I will try to comment very briefly. But as you know, Senator, the Anti-Money Laundering Act provides that Treasury through FinCEN will develop a registry for beneficial ownership, and that plan needs to be in place by January of next year in order to receive information about the beneficial ownership of entities at creation. So I'm looking forward, if confirmed, to prioritizing getting that registry in place and supporting FinCEN and meeting those deadlines, and supporting the need for additional resources in order to execute against those important requirements, but that will bring tremendous additional transparency to our financial system.
Thank you both for willingness to serve. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. Also, Senator Daines from Montana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you. I want to welcome our two witnesses, and I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of these issues that affect the security of our nation. You have a couple of very important jobs, if confirmed. Like many states, Montana has been adversely affected by the flow of illegal drugs coming across our southern border. Recent media reporting has shed light how China has facilitated drug trafficking in the U.S., including the recent conviction of Tao Liu, who laundered money for the Sonoma cartel, which actually operates in Montana. I was with our law enforcement leaders in Montana on Friday. We literally are holding Mexican cartel members in jails in Montana at times over the last few months. Mr. Nelson, to the extent that you can discuss in an unclassified setting, could you expound upon Chinese money laundering efforts here in the United States and what actions you will take to curb its influence?
Thank you very much for that question, Senator. And certainly my experience in the California Department of Justice, we dealt significantly with the challenges of a number of transnational criminal organizations, but in particularly the Sonoma cartel, which was the biggest one operating in the state of California. And what we found there, too, what you're finding in Montana is the role of Chinese intermediaries. And at the end of last year, end of 2020, the Treasury Department put out a report on illicit finance and illicit finance in the United States, and they actually highlighted exactly the example that you've given. So I think part of the strategy needs to be the threat assessment, which we now have, and the recommendation of tools that will be helpful in interdicting that type of money laundering. And the report that the Treasury Department and the federal government put out about strategies to attack illicit finance in our system noted the importance of the new beneficial ownership tool that through this committee we are now, or if I'm so confirmed, would be support in getting in place by the beginning of next year. So there are a number of recommendations in the report, and I'm happy to, if confirmed, discuss those with you and additional opportunities to address the problem that you've identified.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. I want to shift gears and talk about Iran. I think Senator Tillis brought that up here a moment ago as well. Defiant Iran has continued its pursuit of obtaining a nuclear weapon in spite of multiple presidents' efforts over the past several administrations, but for Iran, often at the expense of its own citizens. For both witnesses under the Jcpoa, do you believe the United States has the right to sanction entities that engage in illicit activities, even if those entities receive sanctions relief under the agreement? For example, should the central bank of Iran get a free pass for its financing of terrorism simply because it received relief under the Jcpoa? Ms. Rosenberg, let's start with you on that.
I appreciate you opening this question, and which is so significant to our national security. The United States has a role and indeed responsibility to push back on the threats to our national security presented by Iran, particularly its support for terrorism, its regional destabilization, and advancing those U.S. interests in that regard and seeking to hold Iran accountable is something that existed alongside and outside of the Iran nuclear deal previously and can and should occur outside of the Iran nuclear deal if the United States enters back into it and it is in some fashion reconstituted. If confirmed, I would welcome the opportunity to hold Iran accountable through various strategies and authorities for its support for terrorism.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg. Mr. Nelson?
I don't have anything to add to that.
That's fine. I've got another question I want to ask anyway, so that's great. The American people recently felt the effects of cybercrime on our food and oil supplies caused by Russian-backed transnational criminal organizations. I strongly believe that deterring such behavior will take more than just robust cyber defenses. Mr. Nelson, what measures will you take to deter cybercrimes and to punish those who commit them?
No, I thank you so much for that question, and this will obviously be a priority to immediately be briefed on the programs as they relate to Russia that are currently in place. The new authorities, as you know, there was recently an executive order in response to the SolarWinds attack, which will provide new opportunities to push back against that type of Russian malicious activity. And I commit to you that I will robustly use the tools of TFI to do exactly that.
Great. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I will respect the time of the chairman here, so thank you.
Thanks, Sir Dave. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Toomey, and to both of you, congratulations on your nominations and to your families. And I had a chance to speak with both Mr. Nelson and Ms. Rosenberg yesterday. Thank you for that opportunity. And I just want to follow up on a couple things because I know the Biden administration is undertaking a review of our sanctions policy and strategy broadly, but you both agree, I believe, that it is incumbent upon the Treasury Department to enforce existing sanction law as is, right?
Yes, Senator.
Yes.
And I raise that because just about a year ago, July last year, actually Senator Toomey and I introduced a bill that was passed called the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which called upon the executive branch to identify officials who were complicit in undermining democracy and human rights in Hong Kong. I think we were both pleased to see the Biden administration sanction 24 officials under that legislation. The legislation also requires that any financial institutions that are facilitating those individuals be sanctioned. To date, that hasn't happened, and maybe it's because we've been unable to identify those financial institutions, but Senator Toomey and I have written to the Treasury Department and asked for a classified briefing on that, and I do look forward, if you're confirmed, and I support your confirmation, to follow up on the capabilities we have for tracking those institutions. In a similar vein, we passed something called the Brink Act, the Auto Warm Beer Brink Act. Senator Toomey, myself, the chairman, Senator Brown, all very involved in passing that legislation, which requires mandatory secondary sanctions against financial institutions or other firms we identify that are violating the sanctions with respect to North Korea. And in March of this year, the United Nations, a panel, put together a report indicating there are big holes in the sanctions regime and that there's lots of leakage here. And yet, we haven't seen the Treasury Department impose secondary sanctions. And so one question is, how is it that the UN has identified and be able to make the conclusion we have big leakage in our sanctions regime, and yet the Department of Treasury has not yet imposed those secondary sanctions? Do you have Do you have an explanation for that? And if you don't, I look forward to hearing it if and when I hope you're confirmed. Either of you. What would be the cause of that? Starting with Mr. Nelson.
No, thank you for the question, and thank you for meeting with us and the opportunity to have a frank conversation. I would welcome the opportunity to be briefed on the intelligence if confirmed, and come back to you to continue to discuss this with you, and obviously recognizing that secondary sanctions are and can be a really powerful a tool that we have at our disposal. So I appreciate your leadership on that, and would welcome, if confirmed, to be able to continue to talk with you about that.
Thank you. Ms. Rosenberg?
Thank you, Senator. And I'd like to recognize your leadership on North Korea, as well as a number of other significant sanctions authorities that the Treasury Department has. The Brink Act provides authorities to address North Korean threats, and there are other important statutes there related to nonproliferation, for example, that may also be well suited to addressing the particular threats that North Korea presents. And I'm familiar with the panel of expert report you just mentioned from the UN, and unfortunately, they have documented a variety of ways in which North Korea moves around international and U.S. sanctions. If confirmed, I would welcome the opportunity to speak further with you about the Brink Act, its authorities, and other appropriate authorities to address North Korean proliferation and threats to U.S. interest.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There just seems to be a disconnect, right, between the fact that this UN panel of experts that doesn't necessarily have access to all of our intelligence capabilities can identify big gaps in the sanctions regime, and yet we haven't yet imposed secondary sanctions. I understand there are certain standards we have to apply in terms of due diligence and due process before we ultimately apply sanctions, but still, there seems to be a big gap there. I look forward to working with both of you on that. And I have some other questions which I will submit for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Thank you to both witnesses for being here and providing testimony and your candor and answering these questions. I think it was a useful discussion for all of us. It's clear there's much more work to be done by these nominees to protect our national security. I hope to move forward quickly on your nominations when we return in July. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, given the upcoming 4th of July holiday recess and state work period, those questions are due this Friday, June 25th. To expedite moving forward the nominees, we'd like your responses by Thursday, July 1st. If you would note that, thank you for your testimony today. With that, the hearing is adjourned.